So I want you to just imagine for a second standing inside the rotunda of the National Archives.
Right, Washington, D.C.
Exactly. You're looking down at the original parchment of the United States Constitution.
A foundational blueprint.
Yeah, the blueprint. And as you're standing there looking at it, you realize something pretty jarring. According to a Gallup poll from June 2026, 77% of the people in that room with you,
Wow.
and 77% of the country at large, they believe the founders would be bitterly disappointed in the America we live in today.
I mean, that is a staggering number.
It is. And it makes you wonder, how does that happen? How does a nation with, a functioning economy, food on the grocery shelves, no crumbled infrastructure, just lose complete faith in its own existence?
Right.
So today we are doing a deep dive into the defining condition of America in mid-2026, a phenomenon that our sources are calling the legitimacy recession.
And we have a massive stack of source material to unpack to answer that question today.
We really do.
We're going to be looking at macroeconomic audits, financial risk analysis from the Stanford Graduate School of Business, the latest Pew research on political typology, and even some pretty intense cultural theory.
Yeah, including that Marxist critique of modern identity politics.
Exactly. The goal here is to really understand the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of this crisis. Because a legitimacy recession, well, it isn't a failure of physical infrastructure.
Right, the bridges aren't falling down.
No, the bridges are fine. It's a failure of trust.
But before we go any further, I want to establish a really clear ground rule with you, our listener.
Yeah, this is important.
The sources we're dissecting today, they contain some highly charged political narratives. I mean, we are looking at the 2026 Trump administration. We're looking at radical left-wing activist networks like Antifa and the DSA.
The culture wars, the class wars.
All of it, everything in between.
Yeah.
So I want to be explicitly clear here that we are strictly impartial guides.
Absolutely.
We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing any viewpoints, any candidates, or any political movements, right?
Right. Our job is merely to report the factual content and the ideas contained within this provided source material.
Just to help you understand the landscape.
Exactly. We are here to examine the machinery of the moment. And that machinery of mid-2026, it's defined by four massive interlocking realities.
Okay, let's lay them out.
You've got an ongoing war with Iran, a staggering $100 billion fuel shock, a deeply bifurcated K-shaped economy, and this cultural class rebellion that is just fracturing the social fabric.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand why our modern institutions are buckling under all this pressure, I think we first have to start with what they were originally built to do.
Right.
And the timing on this is incredibly poignant because America is standing right on the doorstep of its semi-quincentennial.
The 250th anniversary.
Yeah, the big 250. So let's look at those charters of freedom housed in the National Archives.
Well, the documents themselves, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, they're basically structural blueprints.
Right.
Our source material actually details how the Constitution was transcribed on parchment by a clerk named Jacob Shallis.
Just a guy with a quill pen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But what Shallis was writing down was essentially an engineering schematic for managing human friction.
Managing fiction, I like that.
Yeah, because look at it. Article 1, it vests all legislative powers in a Congress split into a House and a Senate, right?
Yeah.
Giving the House the sole power of impeachment.
And then Article 2 is the executive power, the president as commander-in-chief.
Right, and Article 3 establishes the judicial power in one Supreme Court.
But the genius of that design, as I understand it from the sources, isn't that it forces everyone to, hold hands and sing Kumbaya?
No, not at all.
It's a machine designed specifically to process disagreement.
That is the core mechanism right there. The founders assumed factionalism.
They knew we'd fight.
Oh, they assumed people would violently disagree on policy, on religion, on economics. The Constitution was designed to arbitrate that conflict peacefully.
Like a referee.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's a system of checks and balances where institutions act as the neutral referees. You don't have, like the opposing team, I mean, you can hate them, but you have to trust that the referee is calling the game fairly.
Which brings us right back to that devastating Gallup data from the eve of the 250th anniversary.
Yeah, the 77%.
Right, but there's more. Only 19% of Americans actually think the founders would be pleased with the state of the republic.
Only 19%.
And when you look at the approval ratings for the actual institutions, I mean, it's abysmal. Congress, the Article I branch designed to be the beating heart of democratic representation, it hit a record low approval rating of 10% in April 2026.
10%. That's almost a rounding error.
Disapproval is at 86%.
Hmm.
And furthermore, only 17% of Americans trust the federal government to do the right thing most of the time.
See, and this right here is the empirical evidence of the legitimacy recession.
So let's define that term clearly for the listener.
Sure. So a typical economic recession, that just means the gross domestic product is shrinking, right?
Yeah.
Less money.
A legitimacy recession means the shared belief in institutional neutrality is shrinking.
Okay.
Civil society hasn't collapsed. Local governments are still issuing permits. The stock market still opens at 9:30 a.m. every morning.
The traffic lights still change from red to green.
Exactly. The physical nation is completely intact. But the psychological nation has entered what the sources describe as epistemic warfare.
Epistemic warfare. I want to break down that phrase because epistemology, that's the study of knowledge, of what is actually true.
Right.
So we aren't just arguing over, whether taxes should be 20% or 30%. We are arguing over baseline reality itself.
Because when you lose a trusted referee class, you basically stop trying to persuade your political opponents.
You just give up on talking to them?
Pretty much. If you believe the media, the courts, the administrative agencies, the election systems, if you think they are fundamentally corrupt,
That they've been captured by the enemy team.
right, then you view those institutions as weapons. The goal of politics completely shifts from passing laws to just seizing the referees.
I look at this dynamic and I think of that sports game analogy, where both teams, the coaches, the fans in the stands, they're all absolutely convinced the referees have been bribed by the other side.
Right.
My question is, if nobody trusts the refs, how does the game not just end in a massive brawl on the field? I mean, how does the country keep functioning?
Well, the sheer momentum of a $39 trillion economy creates an immense amount of inertia.
People still have to eat.
Exactly. Most people just have to wake up and go to work. However, the system is incredibly brittle.
Brittle.
Yeah, a society with zero trust buffers, it can survive in a vacuum for a while, but it becomes dangerously volatile when it's exposed to a massive real-world stress test.
And that brings us to the acute load-bearing variable of 2026.
Yes, it does.
The exogenous shock,
The war?
the conflict with Iran.
Yeah.
This is the undeniable macroeconomic earthquake that is just completely consciously missing from a lot of the domestic partisan squabbling right now.
It's crazy how ignored it is in the rhetoric. It really is. But it is screaming at us from the financial data in our sources.
So let's lay out the timeline for the listener. On February 28th, 2026, the U.S. and Israel engaged in direct military strikes on Iranian officials.
Right, and this wasn't just a proxy skirmish.
Yeah.
This was the kickoff of an active war.
And the immediate geopolitical and economic retaliation, that centered on the Strait of Hormuz.
Right, and for context for anyone listening, the Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman.
Right.
It is the world's most critical oil choke point. Roughly 20% of global oil consumption passes through it.
20%.
Right, so when a hot war disrupts shipping in that specific strait, the global energy market experiences an immediate cardiac arrest.
The receipts on this shock are just brutal. A Moody's estimate in the source material calculates that this war cost American families roughly $100 billion in energy spikes.
100 billion.
Gasoline prices surged more than $1 per gallon above pre-war levels almost overnight.
It was instant.
And the human cost, we have to mention, was also direct. By mid-June 2026, the Pentagon confirmed 13 U.S. military members were killed in action.
Right. A 60-day ceasefire was eventually signed on June 17, but then hostilities resumed a little over a week later on June 26.
After an attack on commercial shipping.
Exactly. So we really have to look at how this geopolitical shock transmitted into domestic economic suffering.
Right.
Because the macroeconomic data from May 2026 is staggering. Headline Consumer Price Index, or CPI, it hit 4.2% year over year.
Which is high.
Very high. But when you look under the hood, that inflation was driven almost entirely by a 23.5% surge in the energy index.
Yeah, let me make sure I'm reading this right. Over 60% of the entire monthly inflation increase came strictly from energy costs.
That is exactly what the data shows. And this hit at the exact moment the federal government's finances were already bleeding.
Right, they were already in trouble.
Deep trouble. The federal deficit was running at $1.25 trillion for just the first 8 months of fiscal year 2026.
Unbelievable.
And the direct military costs of the war, which were estimated somewhere between $34 and $42 billion, those weren't even budgeted for.
So setting up an explosive funding battle in a paralyzed Congress.
Exactly.
But here's what I really want to understand, and the sources really focus on this. They note that this $100 billion war shock, it didn't hit a healthy economy.
No, not at all.
It hit a system that was already structurally fragile. And we are instructed by the source material to look backward at the plumbing of the financial system.
Right, specifically government interventions over the last few years.
Exactly. To understand why this affordability crisis is so severe today, we have to look at how we got here before the war even started.
Right, so we actually have to rewind to September 2019 and then March 2020 to understand that baseline fragility.
Okay.
The sources point specifically to the repo market failure and the subsequent COVID stimulus.
Okay, let's do a quick translation on this. What exactly is a repo market, and why does it matter to someone listening to this right now who is, just trying to pay their electricity bill?
Sure. So repo stands for repurchase agreement.
Okay.
Imagine you are a major bank, okay? You have billions of dollars in super safe assets like U.S. Treasury bonds.
Right, paper wealth.
Exactly. But you need actual cash tonight to clear transactions by tomorrow morning. You essentially take your Treasury bond to an overnight pawn shop, which is just another financial institution, and you say, give me cash tonight, here is my bond as collateral, and I will buy the bond back from you tomorrow morning with a tiny bit of interest.
Okay, so a very short-term, very safe loan.
Exactly. That is the repo market. It is the invisible plumbing that keeps cash flowing through the global banking system on a daily basis.
Okay, so it's the oil in the engine of global finance.
Exactly.
What happened to it?
Well, in late 2019,
Yeah.
and then very violently in March 2020 during the onset of the pandemic, trust in that plumbing just evaporated.
Just vanished.
Yeah. Banks stopped lending cash to each other, even with U.S. Treasuries as collateral. They were too scared.
Wow.
The interest rates in this overnight market spiked massively. The engine essentially seized up.
So what did the government do?
To prevent a total collapse of the global financial system, the Federal Reserve stepped in and basically became the pawn shop of last resort.
Right.
They flooded the system with trillions of dollars in liquidity.
And that was just the beginning, right? Because then, immediately after, we have the COVID stimulus checks, the Paycheck Protection Program, and then later, the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yes.
The government was just injecting trillions of dollars of newly printed money directly into the economy.
Trillions. And every single one of those interventions was designed to solve an immediate crisis or, promote a specific policy goal like green energy in the case of the IRA.
Sure, they all had good intentions.
Right. But the cumulative mechanical effect was that the money supply absolutely exploded, while the actual production of goods and services was constrained by supply chain issues.
And more money chasing fewer goods mathematically equals inflation.
Always. Furthermore, the national debt ballooned to near $39.3 trillion by 2026.
$39.3 trillion.
With net interest payments alone crossing the $1 trillion mark annually.
So just to put this in everyday terms for the listener, the U.S. government basically maxed out a dozen credit cards to keep the house from falling down between 2020 and 2025.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
And then, just as things are supposedly settling down, a war breaks out in the Middle East, blowing up the global oil supply and spiking energy costs by 23.5%.
Yep.
The system had absolutely no shock absorbers left.
Zero shock absorbers. And that lack of buffers resulted in a deeply bifurcated reality, which economists in the sources refer to as a K-shaped economy.
Okay, let's unpack the K-shape.
So the letter K has an arm that points up and an arm that points down.
Right.
The upward arm represents affluent households, large corporations, asset owners. When inflation hit, their asset values, like their stock portfolios and real estate, they often rose with it.
So they were protected?
Mostly, yeah. I mean, they might complain about the price of a gallon of gas at a dinner party, but it doesn't threaten their actual solvency.
Right. But the downward arm of the K, that is where the majority of the working class lives.
Exactly.
And the sources highlight that lower-income families, non-college educated women, and younger adults, they are being absolutely crushed by this dynamic. Let's look at some of the actual numbers they're facing in 2026.
The median housing costs are a prime example here. The metric they use is PITI, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance.
Okay.
For median income households buying a median-priced home in 2026, PITI is consuming 40% or more of their gross income.
That's insane. The historical benchmark for housing affordability is what, 30%?
Exactly, 30%. So when you cross 40%, families start cutting back on food and medicine just to keep a roof over their heads.
And childcare costs have completely decoupled from wage growth.
Oh, completely.
The national average for center-based care is over $13,000 a year. Our sources note that in many urban centers, daycare actually costs more than in-state public college tuition.
It's unsustainable.
It is, but the statistic that really jumps out to me, honestly, is utilities.
Residential electricity rates.
Yeah.
They have risen to an average of 17.65 cents per kilowatt hour.
And our sources point out a really fascinating detail here. This specific spike in electricity isn't just because of the fuel shock from the war in Iran.
Yeah.
It's also being driven by artificial intelligence.
Right. The infrastructure required to run these advanced AI models, the massive data centers, it requires an astronomical amount of electricity.
Just power hungry.
Incredibly. Estimates project that AI could consume up to 17% of total U.S. power by 2030.
Wow.
So you have a dynamic where a massive technological boom is generating immense wealth for the upward arm of the K-shaped economy, right?
For tech investors.
Exactly. But the physical energy required to run that technology is straining the electrical grid, which drives up the utility bills for the downward arm of the K.
Which is just a brutal irony.
It really is.
But, I am looking at the labor market data from May 2026, and on the surface, it doesn't actually look like a catastrophe.
Right, the headline numbers.
Yeah, the economy added 172,000 jobs. Unemployment is steady at 4.3%. If jobs are growing, why is everyone so furious?
You really have to look beneath the headline figures here. The sources describe the 2026 labor market as a low hire, low fire freeze.
A freeze.
Yeah, companies aren't doing mass layoffs, but they aren't hiring either.
So nobody is moving.
Right. If you lose your job, finding a new one is incredibly difficult. The long-term unemployed, those jobless, for 27 weeks or more, they hit a cycle high of 27.5% of the total unemployed population.
Oh, wow.
And most crucially, real wages, which is the purchasing power of your paycheck after you factor in inflation, they are contracting.
So even if you kept your job, you're losing ground.
Exactly. Your paycheck might be technically larger than it was 2 years ago, but it buys significantly less.
And this puts the Federal Reserve in a terrifying trap.
Yes, it does.
Because the Fed ended quantitative tightening in December 2025.
Right. So let's explain quantitative tightening, or QT, briefly for the listener.
Yeah, let's do that.
If quantitative easing is the Fed pumping money into the banking system to lower interest rates and stimulate the economy, QT is the Fed vacuuming that money back out.
Right.
They do this by letting the bonds on their massive $6.7 trillion balance sheet mature without reinvesting the proceeds. It mechanically removes cash from the financial system, which makes borrowing more expensive, and that's intended to cool down inflation.
Right, so they stopped vacuuming the cash in late 2025, hoping for a soft landing.
Hoping being the key word.
Yeah. But then the Iran war hits in early 2026, energy prices explode, and inflation jumps right back to 4.2%. So in June 2026, the new Fed chair, Kevin Warsh, signals they might have to actually hike interest rates again to fight this war-driven inflation.
Which caused the U.S. dollar index, the DXY, that's a measure of the dollar's value against a basket of foreign currencies. It spiked to a 13-month high of 101.37.
Okay, what does that actually mean, though?
Well, a strong dollar sounds good on paper, but it actually hurts U.S. exports and it tightens global financial conditions even further.
So the Fed wants to cut rates to relieve the pressure on working-class mortgages and credit cards, but they can't because the exogenous shock of the war is driving inflation.
Exactly.
If they cut rates, inflation gets worse. If they hike rates, they crush the working class with debt service costs.
It's a classic lose-lose scenario.
Driven entirely by structural fragility and geopolitical bad luck.
The math is just unforgiving here.
And this is where the political discourse just becomes utterly detached from reality.
Oh, completely.
I mean, look at the partisan narratives in our sources. You have politicians on television blaming each other for the price of groceries and housing.
Every night.
The left blames corporate greed and price gouging. The right blames the Biden administration's historical spending, or they defend the current 2026 Trump administration's tariff proposals.
Right.
But the data clearly shows this is a war-driven fuel shock hitting a system that was over-leveraged by decades of bipartisan monetary and fiscal interventions.
Yeah.
It feels like watching two people standing in front of a house that was just hit by a meteor, and they are standing in the rubble arguing over who forgot to paint the front door.
That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Because when a deeply polarized society experiences acute economic pain, The pain is not treated as a mathematical problem to be solved.
No.
It is treated as raw material to be weaponized. Politicians use the affordability crisis as proof that their opponents are either dangerously incompetent or actively malicious.
Which perfectly transitions us to the psychological state of the voters living through this. We know they are feeling the economic squeeze, but how is that pressure fracturing the electorate?
Right.
The source material provides us with the Pew Research 2026 political typology. And this data, it completely destroys the simplistic narrative of a country neatly divided into just a red team and a blue team.
It really does. The Pew data segments the American public into 9 distinct value-based groups.
9 groups.
Yeah, it reveals a highly complex ecosystem. But for structural analysis, we can basically divide the electorate into 2 main buckets. You have the ideological anchors, who make up roughly 38% of the public, and then you have the mixed middle, who comprise the remaining 62%.
Let's define the 38% first. The ideological anchors.
These are the highly engaged, highly consistent partisans. On the left flank, you have groups Pew identifies as leftward progressives who hold universally liberal views across race, climate, economics, all of it.
Right.
And on the right flank, you have the no apologies, right, who are deeply conservative and highly supportive of figures like Donald Trump.
And our sources point out a really key psychological trait of these anchors. It's something they call high affective hostility. Can you translate that?
Yeah, effective hostility means the animosity isn't just about policy disagreements, it is deeply personal.
Like they hate each other.
They don't just think the other side is wrong about marginal tax rates, they believe the other side is evil, un-American, and an existential threat to the nation's survival.
Wow.
They consume political news constantly, and their political identity is often their primary social identity.
Okay, so that's the highly engaged 38%. What about the other 62%, the mixed middle?
This is where the complexity lies, because the 62% hold cross-cutting views that defy standard party platforms.
Give me an example.
Well, the largest single group in the entire Pew typology is what they call the order and opportunity left at 18%.
Okay.
They lean democratic and support a strong social safety net, but they are also deeply concerned about crime, they're supportive of law enforcement, and they favor some immigration restrictions.
Interesting.
Right. And on the other side, you have the pragmatic and polite right, who hold conservative economic views, but are deeply uncomfortable with aggressive political rhetoric, and they actually value institutional compromise.
Honestly, on paper, this sounds somewhat encouraging.
You would think so?
Yeah, we have a 62% majority of Americans who are cross-pressured, exhausted by the screaming matches on cable news, and apparently just want practical, boring governance. But my question is, if that is mathematically true, why does our politics feel like an absolute madhouse? Why does it feel like the fringes dictate every single policy decision?
The sources address this by debunking a very popular misconception, which the authors call the agency inversion myth.
Agency inversion. Walk me through the mechanics of that.
The popular myth is that the extreme 38% actively suppressed, silenced, or marginalized the moderate 62%.
Like they staged a coup.
Right. The narrative is that the radicals hijacked the political machinery against the will of the majority.
But that's not true.
The data tells a very different story. The middle wasn't hijacked. They vacated the field of play.
They just left.
Look at the group Pew calls the tuned-out middle. They represent a significant chunk of the electorate, but their voter turnout in 2024 was only 32%.
32%.
Only 31% of them say it really matters who wins control of Congress in the 2026 midterms.
Yeah.
They do not watch political news. They do not donate to campaigns.
So the engaged partisans didn't break into the car and steal the steering wheel. The moderate majority just got tired, climbed into the back seat, and fell asleep, leaving the keys in the ignition.
Exactly. Nature abhors a vacuum, and political power operates on the exact same principle. The engaged 38% occupy the space that the disengaged 62% completely abandoned.
Wow.
And this is compounded by the mathematical mechanics of primary elections in the United States.
Oh, right. Explain how the primary system acts as an accelerant here.
So in most states, general elections are preceded by partisan primaries, right, where only the most dedicated voters show up.
Right.
Turnout is often abysmal, sometimes 15% or 20%. Because the mixed middle doesn't vote in primaries, the candidates are chosen entirely by the ideological anchors.
I see where this is going.
Therefore, to win a primary, a politician doesn't need to appeal to the broad middle. They have to pledge absolute loyalty to the extreme fringe.
Right. If a Republican candidate admits that climate change is real, or a Democratic candidate says we need tighter border security, they will be instantly crushed in their primary by a challenger who feeds the effective hostility of the base.
Exactly. The system structurally rewards extremism and punishes compromise.
Which just creates a feedback loop where the middle gets even more disgusted and tunes out even further, leaving the anchors with even more power.
Yep.
And this tribalism completely warps how people perceive reality itself.
Let's look at the Gallup Economic Confidence Index from May 2026.
This data is wild.
It really is.
Yeah.
The overall national score is -45. People feel terrible about the economy.
Yeah.
But when you look at the partisan breakdown, it is mind-bending.
The partisan gap is 102 points.
102 points.
Republicans are sitting at a positive 22, indicating relative optimism. Democrats are sitting at a staggering -80. Independents are at -58.
Now, for context, Donald Trump is in the White House in mid-2026, serving his second term.
So Republicans feel optimistic simply because their guy is in the Oval Office, while Democrats feel like the economy is a post-apocalyptic wasteland.
Exactly.
But I have to challenge the validity of these polls. I mean, are people actually logging into their bank accounts, reviewing their grocery bills, and giving an objective assessment of their financial health? Or are they just using the survey as an opportunity to wave a foam finger for their political team?
You are identifying a phenomenon the sources call expressive responding.
Expressive responding.
Yeah, it is a critical flaw in modern polling. Expressive responding means that a voter's answer to a factual question is actually a statement of political loyalty.
So they're lying.
Sort of. When a Democrat tells a pollster in 2026 that the economy is catastrophic, they aren't necessarily doing a macroeconomic analysis. They are signaling their absolute rejection of the Trump administration.
And when a Republican says the economy is great, they're signaling tribal loyalty, even if they're personally paying $4.50 for a gallon of gas and their mortgage payment is suffocating them. And the source material notes something really fascinating here. If you actually financially incentivize respondents, like if you pay them to give an empirically accurate answer about economic trends, the partisan gap shrinks significantly.
Which is so telling.
They know the truth. They just choose to lie to the pollster for tribal reasons.
It proves that the 102-point gap is largely a measurement of identity, not a measurement of objective reality.
Right.
Though the data does show that the $100 billion war shock in 2026 was so violently expensive that it managed to briefly pierce the partisan armor.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Republican economic confidence dropped 33 points between February and May of 2026.
Oh, wow.
Severe localized pain at the gas pump is one of the few things that actually overrides expressive responding.
But the overarching theme remains. Voters are retreating into highly fortified partisan realities.
They are.
And when the electorate abandons a shared reality, the political and financial elites abandon the hard work of democratic persuasion. They start looking for shortcuts. They start looking for structural leverage.
And this brings us to a really profound risk analysis from Amit Serow, a professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business.
Right.
He writes extensively about the erosion of trust as a systemic fragility.
Serow poses a great riddle in the text. He asks, what do the Federal Reserve, cryptocurrency, and hedge funds all have in common?
And his answer is that they are all entirely dependent on trust to function.
So let's break down his analysis of the shadow banking sector first, because when we say shadow banking, we're talking about financial intermediaries that act like banks facilitating credit and liquidity, but operate outside traditional banking regulations.
Right. Serow specifically points to highly leveraged hedge funds operating in the U.S. Treasury market.
Let's do the ELI-5 on this. How does a hedge fund use leverage in the Treasury market, and why does it matter to us?
Okay, so leverage is essentially borrowing money to amplify your potential returns. Imagine you buy a U.S. Treasury bond. It's very safe, but the yield is low. To make real money, a hedge fund will take that bond, use it as collateral to borrow cash, often in that repo market we discussed earlier, and use that cash to buy another bond.
Right.
Then they use that bond as collateral to borrow more cash, and so on. They stack leverage upon leverage. It creates a massive house of cards.
Okay, so they're building a skyscraper out of margin loans.
Exactly. And Serow points out that this system is dangerously opaque.
Meaning nobody can see it.
Right. Regulators don't have clear visibility into how much leverage is actually stacked up in the shadows. So when a sudden shock hits the system, like the March 2020 panic or the 2026 Iran war, lenders get spooked and demand their cash back.
This is a margin call.
Yes. The hedge funds are forced to fire sale their treasury bonds all at once just to raise cash.
Which causes the price of U.S. government debt to crash, basically freezing the global financial plumbing.
Precisely. The shadow banking sector provides flexibility when times are good, but because it operates in the dark, it relies entirely on blind trust.
And when trust vanishes.
The hidden leverage triggers a systemic liquidity shock.
Seru also applies this lens of trust to the crypto industry, which is interesting because the original promise of cryptocurrency was to build a trustless financial system, right?
That's their goal.
A decentralized utopia where you don't need to trust a bank or a government because the math on the blockchain guarantees the transaction.
Right.
But the source material shows that by 2026, the crypto industry has largely abandoned that ethos.
Yeah, the analysis notes a significant shift here. Instead of pushing for comprehensive, transparent regulatory frameworks, which is, the boring work of building institutional trust.
Right, going to committee hearings.
Exactly. The crypto industry in 2026 is instead aggressively seeking populist political endorsement from the Trump administration.
They just want a champion.
They're looking for a political savior to grant them favorable treatment. Seru argues that relying on a political hype man instead of clear rules is a symptom of a deeply fragile sector.
And this reliance on shortcuts and leverage over transparency and persuasion, it perfectly mirrors how our political system is operating in 2026.
It really does.
Because nobody trusts the legislature to pass laws fairly, the entire machinery of government has shifted to exploiting structural leverage.
And we see this most clearly in the normalization of executive emergency powers.
Right.
The source material outlines how the Trump administration, in its second term, is aggressively utilizing executive authority to bypass a gridlocked Congress.
Because Congress can't pass anything.
Right. They are implementing a vast restructuring of the civil service, often affiliated with the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, to assert direct presidential prerogative over tariffs, immigration enforcement, and federal regulations.
And Congress is largely incapable of pushing back because Congress itself has abandoned persuasion in favor of what the sources brilliantly call cartographic optimization.
Cartographic optimization. It's such a great academic euphemism for extreme gerrymandering.
It is. Let's explain the mechanics of this because it's the ultimate form of political leverage.
Right.
Instead of a politician looking at a map of a city and trying to convince 51% of the voters to support them, the politician uses advanced mapping software to just redraw the district lines.
Exactly.
They meticulously pack all of their opponents' voters into one single district while spreading their own voters across 3 different districts. They pre-program the mathematical outcome of the election before a single ballot is cast.
The sources highlight mid-decade redistricting efforts in states like Texas and North Carolina as prime examples of this.
Right.
When politicians choose their voters, rather than voters choosing their politicians, the legislature ceases to be a representative body. It just becomes a fortress of incumbents.
So if the president is ruling by executive fiat and Congress is paralyzed by mathematical gerrymandering, where do the actual laws of the land get decided?
The leverage shifts to the judicial branch.
The courts.
Right. The sources note a profound judicial consolidation in 2026. The Supreme Court, operating with a 6-3 conservative supermajority, has effectively become the ultimate policy arbiter.
And a key mechanism here is the reversal of the Chevron doctrine.
Yes.
Explain Chevron briefly for us.
Okay, so for decades, the Chevron deference meant that if Congress passed a vaguely worded law regarding, say, environmental pollution, the courts would defer to the technical experts at the EPA to interpret and enforce the details of that law.
That makes sense. Let the scientists decide how many parts per million.
Exactly. But by reversing that doctrine, the Supreme Court ruled that federal agencies no longer receive that deference. Now, federal judges have the ultimate authority to interpret the minutiae of regulatory policy.
So the courts are basically operating as a quasi-legislative chamber.
Pretty much.
I want to use an analogy to tie all of the structural leverage together.
Sure.
Think of the U.S. government as a smartphone operating system, right? It was coded 250 years ago by Jacob Shallus and the founders, but it hasn't had a major structural software update in decades.
Right.
Instead of writing new code, which would require Congress to actually negotiate and pass major legislation, both political parties are just exploiting bugs and backdoors to get what they want.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening.
They use a creative executive order over here, a mathematically gerrymandered map over there, a Supreme Court ruling to override an agency here.
Yeah.
They are hacking their own operating system.
Yep.
But what happens when you keep exploiting bugs?
Eventually, the operating system crashes.
Yeah.
The phone just bricks itself.
Exactly. You can't run a global reserve currency, and you can't run a democracy purely on technicalities and backdoors. Because when the losing side sees that they didn't lose fair and square, that they were beaten by a gerrymandered map or a shadow banking liquidity drain, they view the entire system as fundamentally illegitimate.
Which brings us to a critical inflection point in the source material. This widespread institutional disgust hasn't just fueled right-wing executive action or financial opacity. It has spawned a fierce cultural and class rebellion on the political left.
And the target of this rebellion isn't just conservative politicians.
No.
It's the liberal elites themselves.
This is where we dive into the work of Catherine Liu.
Yes, the cultural theory.
The source material includes a video interview she did with the Institute of Art and Ideas, where she mounts just a devastating Marxist critique of modern liberal identity politics.
It's really fascinating stuff.
And her core target is a group she calls the professional managerial class, or the PMC.
So to understand Liu's critique, we first have to define who the PMC actually are.
Right.
According to Liu's sociological framework, the PMC currently makes up roughly 25% of the American workforce.
Good.
They are the highly credentialed, college-educated elites. They are the senior lawyers, the university administrators, the NGO directors, the media executives, the corporate managers.
Right, and a crucial historical context she provides is that back in the year 1900, this managerial class only accounted for about 3% of the workforce.
3%.
So over the last century, this specific class has exploded in both sheer size and cultural dominance.
And the defining ideological feature of the PMC, according to Liu, is a profound, almost religious belief in meritocracy.
Meritocracy, right.
They believe that because they attended elite universities, acquired the right credentials, scored in the top percentiles on standardized tests, that they possess a neutral, objective mastery of how the world should be run.
They think they're just smarter.
Exactly. They believe their wealth and cultural power are entirely deserved because they earned it through intellect.
But Liu points out the incredibly dark, psychological flip side of meritocracy.
Which is?
If you truly believe that you are wealthy and powerful because you are inherently smart and hardworking, what is the logical conclusion you draw about the 60% of Americans who don't have college degrees?
Mm-hmm.
The people who are drowning under 17.65-cent electricity bills and $13,000 childcare costs?
The logical conclusion is that they deserve their suffering.
Exactly. If the winners are smart, the losers must be stupid or lazy.
Wow.
Liu argues that the PMC views the working class with a mixture of profound alienation and outright contempt. She actually cites a very revealing quote from a political consultant for Kamala Harris, who reportedly argued against focusing campaigns on economic struggle because, and I quote, "that would make us look like losers."
Good grief.
The elite class views material struggle not as a systemic failure, but as a personal moral failing.
And here's where Liu's theory gets really fascinating. She argues that to mask this vicious class warfare, to hide the fact that they are benefiting from the exploitation of the working class, the PMC has engineered a massive shift in how we talk about politics.
Right, a shift in the discourse.
She says the elites move the discourse from Karl Marx's hidden abode of production to the hidden abode of seduction.
Let's break down those terms, because
Yeah.
they're important. The abode of production is traditional, materialist, left-wing politics. It focuses on wage labor, unionization, workplace safety, the actual physical conditions of the working class.
Nuts and bolts economics.
Right. It is about how money and power are distributed. The abode of seduction, however, abandons economics entirely.
Okay, what does it focus on?
It focuses obsessively on personal trauma, psychological suffering, interpersonal microaggressions, and abstract identity categories.
So Liu essentially accuses the PMC of commodifying and gentrifying trauma.
Gentrifying trauma, exactly.
She provides some brutal, high-profile examples to illustrate the mechanism here. She criticizes politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for live-streaming their personal emotional trauma on platforms like Instagram.
Right.
She points to figures like Prince Harry and Oprah Winfrey, arguing that they have leveraged familial and psychological trauma into a highly lucrative formula for personal branding.
Liu refers to this as the theater of empathy.
The theater of empathy.
And the mechanism works like this. Within PMC culture, displaying public trauma grants you moral authority.
Okay.
If you can articulate your suffering using the correct academic terminology, you authenticate yourself as virtuous. But Liu argues this is a completely individualized narcissistic
It
exercise.
doesn't help anyone else.
Exactly. It bypasses what she calls subjective development, the hard, quiet work of building actual character, and it completely prevents true class solidarity.
She uses a really brilliant metaphor for this. She compares modern social media users steeped in PMC culture to disco balls.
It is a striking image.
It really is.
She argues that instead of functioning as a cohesive community capable of organizing for material change, we are all just isolated, specular selves. We're just shiny disco balls bouncing reflections of our own trauma off of each other in a hall of mirrors.
That's depressing.
It creates a tremendous amount of cultural noise and emotional exhaustion, but it does absolutely nothing to change the economic structure of society.
Let me try and summarize Liu's critique with an analogy just to see if I have the mechanics right here.
Go for it.
It's as if the working class is bleeding out from a severe wound,
Right.
right? They can't afford rent, their wages are stagnant, their utilities are skyrocketing.
Right.
And the PMC elite walk up to them, and instead of offering a tourniquet or a living wage, they offer a very expensive designer Band-Aid labeled empathy.
Yep.
The elites look at the working class and say, I see you, I validate your trauma, I am using the correct inclusive language to describe your pain. But simultaneously, those exact same elites are managing the hedge funds that are buying up single-family homes and raising the rent. Or they're running the corporations that are outsourcing the jobs.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. Liu argues that PMC identity politics operates as a psychological substitute for material redistribution.
It's a smokescreen.
It allows the elite to feel morally superior without having to surrender a single dollar of their wealth or power. And critically, Liu argues that the popular visceral hatred of this dynamic, the working class revulsion toward this smarmy, manicured, focus-grouped elite empathy, is exactly the fuel that powers right-wing populism.
Oh, wow.
Donald Trump succeeds largely because he uses blunt, unpolished language that connects with the 65% of Americans who feel patronized, lectured to, and economically exploited by the PMC.
But the sources also detail a counter-movement emerging on the political left, right? A faction that is actively rejecting the PMC's trauma culture and returning to the abode of production.
Right, they're returning to hard, material reality.
The source material focuses on the rise of municipal socialism as the primary vehicle for this return. And New York City in 2026 serves as the primary case study here.
Let's talk about Mayor Zoran Mamdani.
Yeah.
He won the mayoral election in 2025, taking office in 2026.
Right.
The mechanism of his victory is actually important. He won 56% of the vote in the final round of ranked choice voting.
Right.
But what is truly notable is how he campaigned. He completely bypassed the abstract academic trauma language of the PMC.
He explicitly branded his platform as pothole socialism.
Pothole socialism.
Such a brilliant framing.
It forces the political conversation back to acute material failure. Mamdani's agenda wasn't about esoteric cultural grievances. It was relentlessly focused on rent control, the price of groceries, funding early childhood care, implementing free public transit.
And quite literally, municipal trash containerization, getting the garbage bags off the streets of New York.
Exactly. The sources explain the underlying logic of why this resonates so much. In high-cost urban centers in 2026, the conventional Democratic establishment promise of competent liberal management has just lost all credibility.
Right, because people look around and see it's not working.
Voters see that rent is mathematically unaffordable, homelessness is visibly increasing, the subway systems are degrading, competent management of a broken system isn't appealing.
No.
So when a candidate steps up and says, the markets have failed to provide basic necessities, so the government must step in to directly provide these services or aggressively discipline the landlords and corporations, it carries immense political gravity.
And we see the empirical proof of that gravity in the June 2026 primary elections, right? Candidates aligned with the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, swept several major Democratic House primaries in New York City.
Right. They're successfully translating material frustration into localized organizational power.
However, the source material highlights a really fascinating contradiction once these pothole socialists actually attain power.
The reality check.
Right. Mamdani campaigns as a radical democratic socialist, but he is forced to operate within the real-world constraints of executive governance.
The reality of governing a massive city enforces pragmatism. The source notes a highly illustrative event here. Mayor Mamdani successfully secured a $21 billion federal grant to fund affordable housing initiatives in New York.
And he secured that massive grant from the Trump administration.
Yes.
I mean, wow.
Furthermore, Mamdani held direct in-person meetings with President Trump, and both camps publicly described the interactions as cordial and productive.
That is incredible. The cognitive dissonance there for a highly engaged partisan must be absolutely deafening.
It demonstrates the absolute limits of ideological purity. You can campaign on a platform of radical systemic change, but once you are responsible for running a municipality, you have to negotiate with the federal government for funding.
You have to manage municipal bond markets.
You have to negotiate with deeply entrenched police unions. Municipal socialism, at the end of the day, still has to ensure the water runs and the garbage is collected.
Right. Ideological rigidity yields to the mechanical necessity of just keeping the city functioning.
Exactly.
So you have figures like Mamdani trying to practically fix the plumbing at the local level. But what about the factions of the left that look at the systemic fragility, the 17.65-cent electricity bills, the executive overreach, and they decide that the plumbing just can't be fixed?
Right, they just want out.
What happens to the groups who believe the house itself is fundamentally rotten?
Well, that leads us to the final and perhaps most volatile dynamic outlined in our 2026 source material: the rise of intersectional resistance and the absolute rejection of the system.
We really need to examine the massive national protests that occurred on March 28th, 2026. The scale of this is hard to comprehend.
They were dubbed the No Kings protests, and estimates suggest up to 8 million people participated in cities across the United States.
8 million people in the streets.
Yeah.
The sources identify two immediate localized catalysts that sparked the marches: controversial shootings by federal immigration agents and the ongoing outrage over the war with Iran.
Right.
The overarching narrative of the protests framed the executive branch as this imperial authoritarian power. But the source material digs deeper into the actual mechanics of who was marching. This was not a monolithic group of traditional liberals.
Not at all. The sources describe the organizational structure as an intersectional architecture.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It is a highly decentralized coalition of disparate activist networks. You have decentralized Antifa cells, you have intersectional feminist organizations, you have pro-Palestine advocacy groups like Queers for Palestine, and you have various currents aligned with the DSA.
If you look at that list on paper, their specific stated goals seem completely disconnected.
Right.
I mean, a democratic socialist is primarily focused on unionizing workers and securing universal health care. An intersectional feminist is heavily focused on bodily autonomy and reproductive rights. A pro-Palestine activist is focused on university divestment and Middle Eastern geopolitics. How do these completely different movements synchronize to put 8 million people in the streets at the same time?
They synchronize through a shared diagnostic framework.
Okay.
The underlying logic connecting these groups is derived largely from Kimberly Crenshaw's academic theory of intersectionality.
Explain how the mechanics of intersectionality operate in practice on the ground.
Sure. The core mechanical argument of intersectionality is that massive systems of oppression, specifically capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, and white supremacy, they do not operate independently.
Okay.
They are interlocking and mutually reinforcing gears in the exact same machine. Therefore, the logic dictates that you cannot dismantle one gear without dismantling the entire machine.
Oh, I see. So applying that logic, it explains why a domestic LGBTQ rights group would heavily involve itself in protests regarding Middle Eastern foreign policy.
Exactly. Under the intersectional framework, the struggle for Palestinian self-determination against a Western-backed military and the struggle for queer rights against domestic conservative legislation, those are not viewed as two separate issues.
They are the same fight.
They are viewed as two localized fronts in the exact same global war against Western imperial hegemony and capitalist exploitation. Capitalism and colonialism are viewed as the foundational root causes of all localized suffering.
This philosophical framework leads to a massive, dangerous shift in how these groups interact with the government.
It does.
Because if you truly believe that all state institutions, the police departments, the judicial courts, the financial markets, the military, if they are inherently fascist or fundamentally designed to oppress marginalized people, then the very concept of reform becomes absurd.
You cannot reform a machine that is operating exactly as it was designed to operate.
Right. If the system is designed to crush you, asking it politely to crush you a little bit less isn't a viable strategy.
Therefore, the political rationale shifts entirely from reform to abolition.
Abolition.
And this is where the legitimacy recession reaches its terminal velocity. If the institutional referees are viewed as fundamentally illegitimate and violent, then operating outside the law and engaging in what they call direct action becomes morally
How to think
justified.
if it's self-defense.
Exactly. The source material notes that decentralized networks like Antifa explicitly frame property destruction, economic disruption, and direct physical confrontation not as violence, but as necessary self-defense against an existential systemic threat.
I look at this coalition, though, and I have to ask a practical question about its long-term viability.
Yeah.
It sounds to me like they are incredibly unified in their desire to tear down the house because the plumbing is leaking. But do they have any agreed-upon blueprints for the new house they want to build? Or do they even fundamentally want to live in the same house once the old one is gone?
You have identified the fatal structural flaw of the movement right there. The analytical term the sources use for this is a negative coalition.
Meaning they are united entirely by what they are fighting against rather than what they are building toward.
Precisely. They are temporarily bonded by a shared adversary, whether that adversary is the Trump administration, global capitalism, or the military-industrial complex.
Right.
But when you examine the internal mechanics of the coalition, the friction is immense.
Give me an example of that internal friction. How do the gears actually grind against each other?
Well, the most prominent friction is the long-running tension between class-based analysis and identity-based analysis.
Okay.
You have traditional Marxist organizers who argue that focusing obsessively on micro-identities fragments the working class and prevents mass labor organization. On the other side, you have progressive activists who argue that you cannot simply ignore race and gender dynamics in favor of universal economic policies.
And the sources also highlight the deep strategic friction regarding pro-Palestine activism within the broader mainstream Democratic Party coalition.
Yes, absolutely. Furthermore, there's profound disagreement on tactics. The vast majority of liberal marchers who show up for a permitted weekend protest completely disavow the violent, direct action tactics utilized by Black Bloc Antifa cells.
So when this intersectional worldview is subjected to the stress test of reality, it appears incredibly fragile.
It is.
The sources even point out that the activists rarely engage with empirical counter-evidence to their worldview. For instance, the empirical data showing that global capitalist trade, despite its flaws, has driven the largest reduction in extreme poverty in human history. Or the historical data showing that massive attempts to implement state socialism have frequently collapsed into authoritarianism. They seem to prioritize the coherence of their narrative over actual empirical outcomes.
They often dismiss that counter-evidence because their primary objective in 2026 is not to win a high school debate on empirics.
Right.
Their objective is systemic disruption. They view the current system as a state of emergency. But as you noted with the blueprint analogy, successfully tearing down a corrupt institution does not automatically generate a functioning virtuous replacement.
No, it just leaves a hole.
And that is the ultimate existential danger of the legitimacy recession. When a critical mass of the population, both on the populist right and the radical left, decides that the system can no longer be reformed, the nation enters a state of extreme vulnerability to the next inevitable shock.
Man. Let's synthesize the mechanics of everything we have traversed today, because the connective tissue here is really remarkable.
It is.
We started by looking at the engineering spannocks of the Constitution, right? Designed by the founders to peacefully arbitrate friction. And we found a nation 250 years later where that arbitration system has completely broken down, plunging us into a legitimacy recession.
We examined how that brittle, low-trust system was fundamentally compromised by years of monetary interventions.
Right, from the 2019 repo market bailout to the COVID stimulus and the IRA.
Exactly. And we saw what happened when that over-leveraged system was hit by the exogenous shock of the 2026 Iran war. A $100 billion fuel shock, 4.2% inflation, and a K-shaped economy that mathematically crushes the working class.
And then we looked at the mechanisms of how the electorate actually reacted to that economic pain. Because the moderate majority vacated the primary elections with a 32% turnout, the highly engaged, highly hostile extremes took control of the political steering wheel.
Leaving the rest of us in the back seat.
Right. We saw political and financial elites abandon the hard work of democratic persuasion in favor of exploiting structural leverage, whether it's shadow banking hedge funds stacking margin loans in the dark, or politicians mathematically pre-programming elections through gerrymandering.
And we explored the cultural mutations that emerged from this crisis. The professional managerial class utilizing the commodification of trauma to mask their economic dominance, while municipal pragmatists try to fix the potholes.
Meanwhile, an intersectional negative coalition plots the abolition of the system entirely, united only by their shared enemies.
It's a lot.
It is a lot. And I want to talk directly to you, the listener, about why all of these abstract concepts actually matter to your daily life. Because you aren't just observing this legitimacy recession, you are living inside the machinery of it.
You really are.
If you are wondering why your grocery bill feels like an emergency, but the stock market is hitting all-time highs, you are experiencing the mechanical reality of the K-shaped economy. When you open your utility bill and see you are paying 17.65 cents for a kilowatt hour because massive AI data centers are draining the grid, you are feeling the resource strain.
Yep.
When you are navigating office politics dominated by elite empathy culture while your real wages are eaten by inflation, you are experiencing Catherine Liu's critique firsthand. The geopolitical shockwaves in the Strait of Hormuz are directly connected to the price of your mortgage.
The macroeconomic data and your daily lived experience are not separate realities. They are the exact same phenomenon, just viewed through different lenses.
I want to leave you with one final concept to turn over in your mind. We have used the term legitimacy recession relentlessly today, but in the world of economics, the word recession implies something very specific.
It does. A recession is a temporary contraction. It is not a permanent death sentence.
Right.
By definition, a recession implies that a recovery is possible.
But if our national crisis is a recession of trust, the mechanics of the recovery are fundamentally different.
I have to be.
A trust recovery won't come from a new executive order, or a newly gerrymandered congressional map, or a politician magically fixing the system from the top down. A recovery of trust has to be built on a shared reality.
Right.
So look around your own life, your own neighborhood, your own local community. What would the mechanics of a trust recovery actually look like at the ground level before it ever reaches Washington, D.C.?
That's the real question.
If the diagnostic X-ray shows that the structural integrity of our national bridge is fractured, maybe the repair work doesn't start with the politicians. Maybe it starts with the basic mechanics of how we choose to treat our neighbors.
I think that's exactly right.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. Keep questioning the narratives around you, demand to see the underlying mechanics, and don't let anyone convince you the game is over just because the referees are struggling. We'll catch you on the next one.